were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the evil spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell anyone, not to tell who he was. There's another example in chapter 5 where the demonic spirit called him the Son of God. And as I indicated last week, the Roman centurion at the end of Mark, with Jesus on the cross, he says, "Surely this is the Son of God." Mm-hmm. Now, for those that were here, those you recall, it's important to know the context of Mark. It's important to know that Caesar Augustus was also called the Son of God. Caesar Augustus was the big man on campus during this time, a little bit before the time of Jesus, but definitely during the time of Jesus's life. Caesar Augustus was considered the Son of God. There are inscriptions found dated about 9 years before Jesus, as we say, 9 years BC, about Caesar. And I'm going to read a few of these inscriptions that are found, and I think they are, you definitely can hear some echoes from the Gospel of Mark. Here's one inscription. "The most divine Caesar, we should consider equal to the beginning of all things. For when everything was falling into disorder and tending toward dissolution, he restored it once more and gave the whole world a new aspect. Caesar, the common good fortune of all, the beginning of life and vitality. All the cities unanimously, it's easy for you to say, adopt the birthday of the divine Caesar as the new beginning of the year, whereas the providence which has regulated our whole existence has brought our life to the climax of perfection in giving to us the Emperor Augustus, who being sent to us and our descendants as Savior, has put an end to war and has set all things in order. And whereas having become God manifest, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times, the birthday of the god Augustus has been for the whole world the beginning of the good news concerning him." And then another inscription, "As long as Caesar is the guardian of the state, neither civil dissension nor violence shall banish peace." Sounds very similar to a lot of things. Remember, the gospel of Mark begins, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. So I think it's important that we understand how it's almost as if Mark can be written as a rival to the things of Caesar. So I think that's important to remember as we questions or concerns about that. Caesar is definitely the big man on campus at this point. He is considered the Son of God, very divine, for sure. And so we're seeing Jesus as kind of being a counter to what many people believed Caesar was. Saw that in Paul, Philippians chapter 2, about Jesus humbled himself, even humbled himself by hanging on the cross. The way that Jesus was given power, it was not that he took it from someone or someone had to die for him to have power, kind of thing. So I think that's pretty important. So we're going to see.
I do have a question.
Yes.
Is that inscription or inscriptions that you read, was that proclaimed for every single Roman emperor? Like it just got like passed on from one to the other, or is this different when Caesar came?
That I'm not aware of. I just know this was attributed to Caesar Augustus, okay. Who, by the way, Caesar Augustus means great Caesar. And then we got other Caesars in the lineage after him that not every Caesar is a Caesar Augustus, if you will. During the time of Romans, the scripture that was read this morning. During the time of Romans, we've got Emperor Nero, who was extremely, who was very violent. Nuts. Yeah, nuts is a good way to put it. Thank you very much. Very violent. And I mean, knowing how bad Caesar Nero was, it's interesting then to read Romans 13 about obeying the laws of your government, that Paul says. It's just really, it's interesting to know kind of the backstory. So anyway, nonetheless, let's get started. Our chapter is on peace, and very much a lot of the lesson, the songs this morning in worship were about peace or shalom. And let me before we begin, one of the things that and I know this according to the chapter, it's probably a little surface, shallow, if you will. But one of the things that I like so well about Christmas, especially this time of year, and yes, we talk about peace on earth, and it may be a little shallow at times, and the songs we sing are about peace, but it comes after what always seems to be a very divisive election cycle. And so it's really nice I like hearing Christmas songs right away, even before Thanksgiving. Some people don't like that, but just because of the contrast. And so I really appreciate the lessons, the songs, especially after something what I feel is so divisive.
I think we better start singing Christmas carols.
12
months a year.
At the polls.
I like, at the polls,
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if any of you experienced that, but that is, it just makes it more, it's more helpful to me when that happens, I suppose. The yard signs are taken up and Christmas decorations are replaced, which is really nice to see. I was telling someone this morning how strange Christmas decorations can be. Last year at this time during Christmas, Dee Dee and I were in Maui, and we spent 2 weeks there, and we saw a snowman decoration in somebody's yard. It just looked really strange, but had to laugh. Snowman, and then of course Santa Claus, but it was, and some lights. And
Is he wearing a Speedo?
no. So, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But you're talking about Christmas lights.
Mm-hmm.
What if you leave them up year round?
Say that again.
What if you leave them up year round?
Oh, I don't know about that. It's easier. You don't have to take them down then.
Sure, my wife doesn't like that.
Okay. But I know there are some people that I've talked with that very adamant about. I had one professor in seminary who was very much of the Catholic tradition. He does not put up a Christmas tree until what is it? Is it day after Christmas or Christmas Eve?
Christmas Eve.
Christmas Eve. Yeah. I mean, no decorations or anything come out until Christmas Eve. So that was he was adamant about it. It was okay. That's fine by me. So, and I don't know when he would take up his tree, but it would seem to me that it's not up long enough if it's right after Christmas or right before Christmas. So she talks about faux peace, fake peace. And that's really what our chapter is about. In in page 42, she lists what shalom actually means. On the top of page 42, shalom included the presence of justice and economic well-being for all. It was not just the absence of war. And I think that's pretty important. And again, today's lessons and scripture reading talked about peace and how important it is to project real peace and not just this faux peace that we see during this time of year. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Knowing what was going on in the world during the time of Jesus's birth and before, that proclamation of peace on earth, it really has a lot of meaning to it, a lot more than what, again, we might think. The absence of war is oftentimes how we interpret peace. Questions or comments on peace? People say we want world peace. That's great. What does that mean?
I don't know, but I do know that in one of my translations of the Bible, it says peace on earth towards men of goodwill.
Okay.
Which is quite different from peace on earth, goodwill towards men.
Men of goodwill. And I'm going to guess from what I can remember about the Greek translation that could be translated either way. It's kind of like house of partying or party house. It's kind of the same way. So I don't know if there's much to make of that different way of translating it.
It really changes the meaning.
Does it? Okay.
Very much so.
Okay.
Wouldn't it imply that one translation or one meaning that imply that it's more Christian to be goodwill towards all and not just the good people that you like? Towards the evil people or the people that you're doing things that you don't want them to do. That would seem to be more charitable.
Okay.
Say that once more. How you read it.
It's the difference between peace on earth, goodwill towards men, or peace on earth towards men of goodwill.
Doesn't Jesus want us to goodwill to? I mean, it's really easy to be Mike, because Mike is a good guy, but it's really hard to have goodwill towards Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And that's actually a higher test, I think.
And Jesus didn't come to save people who were already believing in God. He came to save those who were sinners, who weren't believing. So he came for the riffraff, if you would, of society. And, as Christians, I think, that's what we're called to do is you got to be nice to everybody. Try anyway.
It's easy to pray for the family, but it's hard to pray for someone who's done you wrong.
Yep. Or, as Pastor Ken was talking about the fruit of the Spirit. I mean, that needs to be towards especially the people that we don't get along with, we don't like very well, for sure. So shalom here includes justice and economic well-being, as our author points out, and we also need to know during this time, you've heard of what's called the Pax Romana, perhaps. It's the peace of Rome. You don't have to know Latin to know what that means, but it's the peace of Rome that started with, I think, began with Caesar Augustus about 27 years before Jesus, and until actually it lasted about 200 years. Caesar Augustus lived from 27 BC to 14 AD. That's kind of the time where he lived. But this peace of Rome lasted about 200 years. And that was during the time of Jesus. Can someone tell me what the peace of Rome would have been? Because peace was definitely a word used often to talk about the Roman empire, that it was an empire of peace. But the peace of Rome, what would that include?
I would think the peace of Rome would be, it's our way or the highway. You know, you couldn't,
yeah.
I don't think that you could be in conflict with them. Obviously, the Jews were oppressed, people were oppressed, unless you followed the Roman way. That would be my understanding.
No, sorry, I was going to finish. Did you have more to say? I didn't mean to interrupt
He
you.
was doing the what?
Were you raising my
done?
hand, but it's hard to raise your hand
Yeah.
if your guys got hand.
No.
I think Ken, you talked about it a while ago. Wasn't it basically the didn't dare attack Roman citizen or the running hell on it?
Yeah, it's what Debbie's getting at. Yeah, the Pax Romana. I'm sure Darren's got it there. It's a pretty heavy-handed piece.
It is. It is definitely about law and order. It's about a large military, expanding borders. As I was studying for this lesson, I remember I was in the military during the time at the end of Ronald Reagan's term. Thank you. I was going to say reign. That'd be a bad.
Go on.
Can we edit that out? And the big thing was peace through strength. And he was all about, so I was in the Navy at the time. He was all about expanding the Navy to a 600 ship Navy, which I believe there's just a little over 300 ships now. So it was all about peace through strength being the military power.
Roosevelt's idea of carry a big stick.
Speak softly.
I don't know.
Speak softly, carry a big
Speak
stick.
softly, carry a big stick.
Okay. Yeah. So this idea of being of the military.
Contemporary with him, Mike.
So they were ever expanding their borders. That was one of the problems why when Rome did fall, their borders were too large. There weren't enough military to provide security. Taxes were excessively high. So there was just a lot of, and if you were opposing the Roman government or the Roman empire, guess what would happen to you?
You get killed.
Same thing that happened to Jesus.
Mhm.
The cross was dubbed Roman billboards. That's why the crucifixion, all the crucifixions were public. These were things that this was a warning towards the public. You go against the Roman Empire, this is what's going to happen to you. And that's exactly what happened to Jesus. So as we move on in the Gospel of Mark, she makes mention there's a huge conflict, a lot of conflict going on in the Gospel of Mark. We have Jesus's temptations in the wilderness, not very much detail given to us from in the Gospel of Mark, unlike Matthew. But it doesn't tell us what the temptations are necessarily or where they're from, but other than the opposing force is Satan. Satan is the opposing force, at least in Jesus's temptation. The word Satan or Satan also has a lot of baggage in it, a lot of meaning from the Hebrew, from what we call the First Testament or the Old Testament. Satan is it can be translated a couple different ways. It could be what's the word? Adversary. Adversary is one way to look at what Satan is. The first human to be called Satan or an adversary. Does anybody know? Who? The king? Cain. No. David. David in 1 Samuel was considered the first adversary, the first human to be called an adversary. Another way to translate Satan or Satan is, oftentimes in our Christian understanding, we think Satan is this red beast with a bifurcated tail and horns and things like that. We can think, who is the Dante's Inferno probably for some of that. But another way to translate it is roadblock. Roadblock. And let me give you two examples. One of them is found in Numbers 21. You remember the story of Balaam's donkey. Balaam's donkey is, Balaam is a Gentile. He just know that he gets on his donkey and he's trying to communicate with some of the generals in Israel's army, and gets on his donkey, and the angel of the Lord stands in the donkey's way, and the donkey moves off the path to avoid the angel of the Lord standing there, and Balaam is hitting his donkey, talking to his donkey, telling him to get back on track. And the angel of the Lord continues to act as a roadblock to what Balaam was wanting to do. So that's an example of Satan being a roadblock. Another one shows up in the Gospel of Mark. We read about it, part of it in our book, where Peter, let's go to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8, this is where Peter tries to stop Jesus, where Jesus predicts his death. Mark chapter 8, verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Get behind me. You're making a roadblock. You're blocking my way. That's another example of how the Satan or the Satan can be translated as a roadblock. Someone standing in your way. Peter wanted to stand in Jesus's way. Why was that? Why do you think Peter rebuked Jesus?
Didn't want to let him go
Okay, well, why not?
because they enjoyed his company and his
Okay.
power and who he was. The fact that he could go around and do fantastic things, and so
Okay.
they gained some sort of like notoriety because they followed him.
Okay. All the above, for sure. All the above. And I'm guessing also, and as she points out in the book, Peter wanted to establish the kingdom like everyone else was doing, like Caesar did it, with the military and with power. And of course, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. So that's another important piece to remember. So that's what Peter wanted. So as she talks about this idea of establishing the kingdom through the military and the power like that versus God's way or Jesus's way, she talks about the two processions that are happening in Jerusalem at the time. We know of one procession that this is during, Palm Sunday, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a big horse, not on a white horse, completely different. But she quotes Marcus Borg's book called The Last Week. Of all the books that I've read, outside the Bible, The Last Week was, in my opinion, the most powerful book that really made a big difference. So she quotes The Last Week by Borg and Crossan, I believe, wrote that book. And she talked about the two processions. One procession where Pilate is coming into Jerusalem not to pay his respects during Passover, but to keep the peace. He brought in a military contingent. If you can imagine bringing in all this military might and power into Jerusalem, it would be quite remarkable to see. I mean, I think we see a lot of people in other countries or presidents, people in power, oftentimes take a day or a week or whatever the case may be and parade the military through town. Kind of like a triumphal entry, as they would say. That's what one of our former presidents wanted to do in Washington, D.C. Until D.C. said, no, it's going to tear up the roads and it's too expensive. But that idea of military might coming in the city. At the same time, Jesus came in on the other side of Jerusalem, not with military might, but on a donkey. I mean, a donkey of all things. Not driving the tanks, not driving the big white horses. And in the book, she doesn't go through it, but the question comes up, which procession would you be involved in? The one where Jesus comes in on a donkey, or the one where all the clanging armor and all the military might was coming from? Which one would you want to be part of?
Are they offering free food?
That I don't know. Doesn't say. But you see that she does a good job with contrasting the power and the strength from Pilate's army to Jesus coming in on a donkey by himself, by the way.
Yeah, but that's where all the joy was,
What's that?
where Jesus came in on the donkey. Everybody was joyful and happy, and they were throwing down their coats and palm branches and everything. They were happy, and it was an exciting, wonderful time. Whereas the other procession was overbearing and kind of scary.
But people were probably cheering there also, because otherwise they were afraid they were going to get arrested or crucified. I mean, seriously, they would have been.
Yeah, that's not where the joy was, though.
Yeah, but people could have acted like it.
And I think, though, that they were expecting Jesus to take over and crush Rome. So they were throwing down their coats thinking, oh, here's our true Messiah, military Messiah, and they're going to overthrow Rome and give us freedom. And that didn't happen, and he was basically dead a week later.
And I think that's that's also part of. Okay, I lost my thought. Sorry. Go ahead.
My mother used to say, you have power until you have to use it.
You have power until you have to use it.
You have to use it, you don't have the power.
Oh, I'd have to unpack that one for a while.
I've been working on it for about 14 years.
That's it? Okay, all right.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, this goes more for the political and I guess economic time there. It
Do we
wasn't.
need to pause the tape at all?
No. Wasn't the riding the donkey symbolism of humility, because if I remember right, price-wise, an ox was really expensive. A donkey was really cheap. And to ride on something really cheap is humbling yourself. If that's what I'm remembering right in my classes that I.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, donkey wasn't the power horse, the big white horse with all the armor on it. Donkey was completely opposite. Yes.
Wouldn't it be like Jesus throwing down the gauntlet, that he's coming in on this donkey, he's presenting a totally different way to look at the kingdom. People are cheering and excited for this. and then they turn on him. So at some point, you have the whole Gospel of Mark, reading this upset me.
Did it?
Because I don't
Okay.
like conflict. And
Oh,
so I had to I
okay.
had to look at it in a different way. And I had to realize that Jesus was, according to Mark, all of these conflicts. And you have to, when there's a conflict, you have to make a choice. You have to make a decision. So it was kind of, to me, then thinking about the Palm Sunday thing, you have to make a choice. Jesus is throwing down the gauntlet. Do you want this or do you want this? Are you going to turn on me when I don't meet your expectations? So to me, this whole Gospel of Mark, according to the way it's presented here, is a challenge. And we listen to the fruit of the Spirit, and those are all wonderful things. But then where does the standing up for the oppressed? How do we make that choice? And for those of us who don't like conflict, that's a double challenge, because you have to make a decision. You have to repent. You have to turn towards God at some point and trust in this kingdom that we look around us and go, oh, I don't see God's kingdom everywhere, but it is. It's here. It's present. And how do we rise to that challenge of being a follower of Christ?
Therein lies, I think, the crux of this chapter, asking that. Yes, Carol.
It says on page 41, she's got conflict is not necessarily negative or harmful. So when you think about it, the only way you really change is the conflict.
Yeah.
Then it gives you a better view of why you should have conflict, I think. Because if we weren't to have conflict, if we'd never disagree, everything would just keep one status quo.
And so it made me really look at that whole idea of conflict and my perception of it. So
this and along the same lines, this idea, I used to think that peace was about lack of conflict, or the absence of war, everybody agreeing, things like that. That's not the case. I mean, I think that's what Tracy does a good job explaining, how there's a lot of conflict in the Gospel of Mark, and for a good reason. Let's talk about the money changers in the temple. I remember going to seminary a long time ago and talking about the sin of the money changers was the corruption.
Right.
Was how the money changers were corrupt. They were cheating the people. But what actually the money changers were actually providing a good service to the people that would come from all over the four winds to Passover. So they didn't have to bring their animals. They could buy them in the temple before they're sacrificed. They would be without blemish. They would just bring the money. And also, not only that, you could not use coins that had the Roman emperor's inscription on it in the temple for the sacrificing. You remember the test that Jesus tested some of I think the teachers of the law, or the Pharisees in the temple. He said, he asked them to pull out a coin, and Jesus asked them whose inscription is on it. And here this temple leader got caught with having the Roman emperor's inscription on his coin. And so he's kind of like busted. But money changers were exactly providing a fairly good service. They were exchanging the money. Also, you can buy the animals instead of bringing them, hundreds of miles away. You can buy them there at the temple. So let's look at that, because I think this is important to know. Let's see, chapter 11. Chapter 11, starting with verse 11. Here's where Jesus goes to the temple. But verse 11 is important to know this. Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Jesus was already at the temple. He came in and he found that it was late maybe not too many people were around, so he went back to Bethany. What does he do the next day when he comes through the temple? He overturns the money changers. She talks about the symbolism here, which is very important because, again, Jesus was already at the temple, saw that nobody was around or not too many people were around. Place was closing up, perhaps. Went back and comes back when more people are around, and then does what? Throws the tables. Very, very symbolic. He was very, it was very methodical. Do it at the right time to make the right statements. And so he says the next day they were leaving Bethany and Jesus was hungry. Talk about fig tree, but let's move on down. Verse 15, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area, began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and will not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Tell me what, I know none of you here are robbers and thieves, but what do robbers and thieves do in their den? Count the winnings? Yeah. What else? I'm sorry? Scheme. Scheme. You guys are scheming. It's not that there's corruption among the money changers necessarily. It was the scheming they were doing. It was that domination system that they were trying to figure out how to oppress many people. So they were scheming. Den of robbers. They don't steal in their own den. They scheme to figure out how to steal more. Yes, Carol.
It's pretty, that's been misused and applying it to the church,
Yes, it has.
including this church.
Money changing. Oh, absolutely. The corruption and how the money changers were stealing from people, and how it was wrong to use money in the church other than for sharing the good news, spreading the gospel.
Well, here it was in objection to selling fair trade.
Right.
Oh, okay.
There were people that left the church over that.
Okay.
Yeah, I made the argument to Sessions that it was because of the corruption, not because of the selling, that was the problem.
Yeah, again, in all actuality, it was a service provided that was very helpful to a lot of people. Changing the money and selling animals to sacrifice. So you don't have to bring your dove 200 miles or your goat. By the time that goat maybe gets 200 miles, it'll be skinny, or what the case may be. So yeah, a lot of this turning over the table, very symbolic. Jesus stopped the operations even just for a little bit. He stopped the things from happening. That was very symbolic. He was there the day before, not enough people were there, so he comes back, and then he overturns the temple. And so, yes.
One of the churches in town used to have a play during Advent or during Easter, and it was called Passion.
Oh yeah, Passion.
Anyway,
you bet.
In that play, they really demonstrated Jesus throwing over the tables, and a lot of people got really upset because they didn't want to see that Jesus would get angry. And they thought that they shouldn't have made Jesus that, because the guy who played it really did a good part. He just threw the tables, and
Okay.
But a lot of people didn't like that because they want Jesus to be that kind, loving teddy bear.
Meek and mild. You bet. Yeah. Yeah. Mark tells us different, doesn't it? For sure. I mean, you imagine. Yeah, Carol, did you have your hand?
Finish what you're saying because I have a little different thought.
If you can imagine Jesus riding into Jerusalem, Jerusalem was a tinderbox. It was ripe for rebellion because, after all, what does the Passover celebrate?
Revelation.
liberation. Absolutely. And who was the oppressors? The Romans at that time. So Jerusalem was a tinderbox, but if you can imagine Jesus coming in on a donkey and what all that indicated. Didn't have any bodyguards around that we know of, but it was ripe for, it was easy to go up in flames for sure. And I'm guessing that's why Jesus picked the Passover to do that. I mean, there was a lot of methodical stuff, even the horse thieving, if you will, that happened before, about the disciples going to get a horse, get the donkey. All that was pre-planned. So it was no coincidence that Jesus came in at the same time that Pilate comes in with his army. Oh my goodness. So Carol. Oh no, that Carol. Sorry.
A little off the subject, but there was a hymn we sang, I think, today about a little child who shall lead them. That struck me as being strange.
Yeah.
I mean, is that just to tie the sentimentality of Christmas with? I just.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that Jesus did that happened to him that he did was totally contrary to what the power structure was of that day. I mean, the born in a manger, that alone that's not how royalty is born. Things like that. How he comes into Jerusalem. It is no coincidence that he gets hung on a cross, because he did challenge the Roman way of things.
But we try to make the born in the manger so pretty and so mild and wonderful. And
in reality, later on, at least in Matthew, we see the killing of 2 years and younger infants. After Christmas, it was kind of bloody. Absolutely. So also thinking about that Caesar and Jesus, think about who was the Caesar that the wise men went to ask for directions? Herod. They weren't exactly the wisest men, were they, when they asked Herod, where's the new king? What? New king? I don't think so. So you wonder how wise they were. But nonetheless, there's just a lot of things that happened during the life of Jesus that if we know what it was like during the Roman oppression, it really brings a lot of this stuff out on how he was completely different. How the peace obviously was not about the absence of war, but having to do with justice. That's very important. That's why there's different schools of thought on the return of Jesus. Some groups think you got to get your life right. You got to, as John the Baptist would say, you got to get your life right. You got to repent. You have to be right. But there's another school of thought that sees, and some would accuse these groups of Christians as progressive or liberal, that sees evil and domination in the systems in our society.
Well, that was more or less how it was throughout the Old Testament. Whenever a prophet came along, that's what they were talking about, is the oppression of the people.
Yeah, but some Christian groups will take the fact that you need to get your life right before Jesus comes back, and the others take that also, but knowing that there is evil and injustice in the systems that we encounter in our daily lives. So they devote their lives to ridding the systems of injustice. I'm thinking Martin Luther King Jr. being one of them. The peaceful protest idea. We got a few minutes. Let's look at the questions in the back.